So hi everyone, I think we will start the session. So today we have a really great speaker here who will then tell you about how to uncover examiner comments on performance management. So over to you, Geoff.
Thank you, Esther. Good morning, everybody. I say good morning because it's 6 o'clock UK time. I think it's 1 o'clock where you are, I think, but then again, I suppose there's more than one country involved here, isn't there? Singapore and Malaysia. Can't say I'm sure that it's the same time zone. Yes, what we're going to do here is talk about performance management. My assumption, I suppose, is that people are in different points in their preparation, but primarily this is an introduction, if you like, to the studying of performance management. And our main concern, our main aim here is to look at, what the examiner's comments are and how you can benefit from looking at them. This is my rather unfortunate mugshot. This is COVID-19 haircut. Not had a haircut there for 4 months, so I don't look that anymore. And I think the videos, if you like, is switched on. Just by way of introduction, and I suppose establishing some degree of credibility. I was a freelance tutor and an employee of Kaplan for many, many years. I was regional director, I think, of SEMA for 5 years within that. And I've also got some ACCA training experience. We did train the trainer in Bangladesh, Pakistan, South Africa. All very, very exciting. And I was definitely involved in the examining panel for this paper when it was first set up. Writing many of the questions and so forth. So I think I've got a lot of PM and indeed for that matter APM experience. What I would say is I've got a couple of LinkedIn groups if you want to join in on them. If you just search ACCA APM or ACCA PM, obviously it's relevant there, PM, then you'll find these groups and they're free to join, and I share free stuff and try and help you out. These days, I suppose partly because of COVID, I've become an online lecturer in both ACCA APM and in ACCA PM. So I've got a little bit of experience. The chat panel is open and there are people in the background there answering those questions if they relate direct to the ACCA. Where they relate direct to this particular paper, we'll deal with those at the end. But if you want to ask questions as you go along, that's completely fine. I can see the number of participants is actually quite low because a lot of people watch this, if you like, afterwards. So it might be that I'll turn the chat panel on so I can see it and answer questions as we go along, which is absolutely fine. Depends on how things go, I suppose. What we're going to do then is have a look at the following 5 or 6 items. Certainly I'm going to give you an introduction to an overview to performance management. What exactly are you, I suppose, up against? And also, I suppose, where do you start? Where do you start studying for PM, and what are the tips I can give you in relation to that? The main point, without doubt, is this examiner's comments. We know from past analysis and speaking with students that have taken papers, they don't always look at examiners' guidances, and it's a real shame, because from my personal perspective as an ex-examiner, I used to write these examiners' guidances and examiners' comments after every paper, and I'd go to some considerable trouble to point out where I suppose I was disappointed, where I was surprised, where could people improve, what big mistakes did people make. And it always surprised me, I suppose, afterwards that people didn't read them. I have to say, when I was a student, I didn't read them either. So I really would encourage people to look at the examiner's comments. They're produced by the examining panel, it says, but it's hard to imagine that the examiner isn't directly involved. And do bear in mind, the examiner and the marking team have looked at thousands of scripts by then. They know exactly where people are going wrong. And therefore, and they talk about it in the examiner's comments. So that's the main thrust of this agenda, I suppose. And springing from that, I'd quite like to talk about, some generic tips and some generic comments which have come out of the examiner's comments, just to give you sort of a feel for the sort of thing that might be in there. We're going to look at a couple of OT questions. You don't have to actually work them, don't worry. The idea of that really is more in terms of, I suppose, technique. And then a brief mention of, the fabulous resources that the ACCA provide. I'm a big fan of the ACCA, I have to say, not just because they're listening, but because the support that's available on the ACCA Global website is simply brilliant. So all sorts of resources in there, example papers, examiners' comments themselves, for example, study guides, tips, approaches, you know, a whole raft of different resources that are all free, all available, and it really is excellent. At the end, we'll deal with any questions that might have arisen, subject to, you know, dealing with them as we're going along. So again, if you have questions as you go along, just answer them in the chat panel, not in the question and answer panel. The chat panel's best, I think, from that point of view. So assuming, you know, you're new to performance management or starting out and studying it to, I don't know, December probably, or possibly even March, you know, what exactly, I suppose, are you up against? Well, the syllabus is actually split into 5 sections, and you can sort of see them there. I can write on this. There is section A, there is section B, C, D, and indeed E. Can't write red on red, can I? And the idea of this syllabus, if you look at it, is actually quite sensible. The idea, I think, is information technologies and systems transcends all the different detailed parts of a syllabus. You'll need information to be able to do the management accounts, for example, hence, if you like, this particular arrow, yeah, or you'll need information and systems to be able to do budgeting, hence, if you like, this particular arrow. So that transcends the entirety of the syllabus. The detail in the center is pretty important. You have management accounting tools, which comes, I suppose, partly back from the management accounting that is in the lower level paper. Yeah, you've got management accounting, performance management, and APM as one stream within this syllabus. And what this does is build a little bit on your management accounting knowledge from the stream below. I'll talk about exemptions shortly. Yeah, but so that's what that is, and it provides management accounting information in order to make good decisions, which is section C there. And it should follow, really, when you think about it, that good decisions will lead to good performance. Yeah, if you make a good decision, then you won't have to work quite so hard, if you like, in managing performance. If you make a bad decision and do something that's inappropriate, then you'll be spending the rest of your days trying to make that work. Yeah, certainly planning and control is a massive part of performance management, surely. The setting of targets, the setting of budgets, yeah, the controlling of an organization is what performance management is all about. Yeah, so have the right tools at the top in B, make good decisions in C, control the business in D, and that should lead to E, you know, overall performance management and control. I think when I was an examiner here, I really concentrated on E. I really liked E, and I would always set a decent sized question in that topic. And I think that's still true, even now with the current examining team. Yeah, one of the section C questions will almost certainly be an E-type question. Yeah, I would say it was a default setting that, you know, people who do performance management, yeah, can assess the performance of an individual business. So you might be given a profit and loss account information, yeah, and ask, how do you think this business is performing? Okay, I'm just going to turn the chat panel on so I can see. Okay, it's just starts time information. Okay, so where does performance management sit in the overall syllabus? I've already alluded to this a little bit, I think, is that it sits obviously above the management accounting. And I suppose people might be concerned if they're exempt management accounting. Exemptions are available if you've got an appropriate degree or other avenue of that. And that's obviously a concern if you're coming into performance management, because the basics of management accounting are certainly examinable within performance management. Now, my advice here is that if you choose a good tutor, they will know that. And they'll know that some of the management accounting is essential. So, for example, the treatment of overheads is covered in management accounting, but it's core knowledge for performance management. But not everything in management accounting is core knowledge for performance management, and therefore you need a good tutor that understands that. Yeah, all the providers that provide courses here would understand, presumably, that management accounting is essential and performance management is part of that. I remember when we created the performance management syllabus, I was very concerned that it wasn't management accounting. It was the interpretation of management accounting information. It was the managing of performance out of the management accounting information. So the management accounting might tell you you're making, a negative contribution or not a very good contribution. Performance management is talking about, well, what do you do about that then? What are the implications of that for the business? So it's a slightly higher paper. What are the consequences of poor management accounting data? Yeah. Of course, if you go further on, you've got these two advanced papers, and they're both, if you like, fed by performance management. The basics, if you like, in performance management come forward to advanced performance management. One of the easiest ways of suggesting it, I suppose, is that performance management is more calculation than written, or there is an element of written certainly within that. It's 50 in the exam, but advanced performance management is more systems of performance management and how those systems are appropriate. I won't talk too much about APM because I suppose it's not entirely relevant to our conversation this morning, but again, it's a feed from performance management, and a good tutor will understand that. And anything that you need within PM to take you forward to APM will be talked about. Performance management, of course, provides some of the basic data for strategic business leader paper as well. So it's an important paper. How can you make decisions about strategy and product and markets if you haven't got the basic management accounting information that you need to do that? So what is the trend of data? Where are we making our money? Where are we growing? Where are we shrinking? What's happening with the market is all things that might be looked at in performance management, which will help you make a strategic business leader choice. I won't talk too much about the link between the top two papers because it's probably not appropriate right at the moment, but it is a confusion for a lot of people. What's the difference between SBL and what's the difference between that and APM? Because actually, when you look at the syllabus, they're very similar. And that's a matter for APM when you get there. If you link in with me on the APM group, you might see the solution to that, if you like. There's this concept, of course, for the management accounting toolbox within this. If you make it an idea that you are, I don't know, a builder walking into a job, you'll have a toolbox with you. You don't necessarily know which tools you're going to need on which particular job. And to some extent, the management accounting toolbox is the same sort of idea. You know how to work out contribution, you know what relevant cash flows are, you know what net present value is, and then when you're presented with a question, you use the appropriate tools. Now, I don't want to give too much of an impression that that's a problem. The examiners within the ACCA are all incredibly fair, looking to help you rather than hinder you wherever they possibly can. So if there's a particular tool that you need, it'll always be specified. It's only at the higher level, the APM level, where that might not be the case. So I hope that makes sense. So you've got, just visualize all these tools that you might need. In PM, the examiner will, generally speaking, tell you which tool to use. In APM, they might not do that. Now, sticking to PM and trying to focus down on just that paper and then talking about the examiner's comments. And again, assuming that you've not necessarily started this paper just yet, or you're about to start, what are you up against? Well, predominantly the exam structure is 60% objectively tested. Now, of course, that doesn't mean multiple choice necessarily, and I'm sure you realize that. It can mean multiple choice, A, B, C, D, which one is right, but it can be multiple response, so 2 of the 4 items or 2 of the 5 items are right. It can even be number entry, so work out your answer, stick it in a box, and just be careful about the formatting and the number of decimal places and so forth. And so therefore, a lot of this exam, you can see 60% section A and section B are objectively tested. Section A, 15 objective questions worth 2 marks each. Yeah, and section B, 3 OT cases. So 1 big scenario and 5 OTs underneath. It's interesting, those 5 OTs underneath, I'll just mention this right now, they have to be independent. So in other words, if there's a question which has got a subsection 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the answer to number 1 can't be needed for the question number 2, right? So if you get number 1 wrong, it's not going to hinder you getting number 2 right. And that's important to realize that they're all independent. So if you're doing a question of that sort, don't get bogged down on an area and just press on, because the second and third and fourth and fifth items will be independent of the previous ones. That's important to recognize that, so you keep your time management under control. Also, just while I'm mentioning that, if in, let's say, the third part of a case study question, so I've got a case study question, 5 parts to it, if in the third part the examiner mentions the answer to part 1 as part of that, because they have to give it, you can't be dependent on it, then it's right. That's the number that is right in part 1. And if you haven't got that, I'd go back and change it. It's rare that, because the examiner will try and avoid doing that, I'm sure. You've then got 40%, 40 marks for 2 scenario-based questions, and this is where things like budgeting is tested, variances is tested, and then this performance management and control question that I referred to before in section E. So normally you get questions of that sort of stature, if you like, in C, not things out of section A of the syllabus typically, more things out of sections D and E. But again, the ACCA guidance will give you the detail about which areas examined in which places. So I'm going to start off here now with a question and turn on my chat panel. Where do you think you should start preparing for PM? If you're going to start, where do you think you should start? What would you do first? I just thought I'd ask that question. What do you think? I mean, do you look at the syllabus? Is that the place to start? Do you look at past exams? Do you look at specimen papers? Some people suggesting, right, starting in the syllabus. Any other suggestions? There aren't that many people online. It's a bit unfair, this really. It's an interesting concept, isn't it? Because you are studying for an examination. You're given textbooks. You're given textbooks if you enroll on a course, and the textbook's quite a meaty document. I've just written one myself for my own APM material, 36,000 words. It's a lot of work, yeah, and that's small. You can get 50,000 word textbooks. They're enormous things, and so actually, where you should start, yeah, is actually with the exam. Look at this. Look at the specimen paper, or more importantly, look at past exams. And the reason for that is, if you think about a subject, for example, in the PM syllabus, there's a subject called Environmental Management Accounting. And if you look at the syllabus, it will tell you there's all sorts of things potentially examinable. It talks about EMA in the context of activity-based costing, EMA in the context of flow cost accounting. Now, you might not know what these terms mean, admittedly, but then when you look at the exam, you realize that what's actually being examined isn't the detail of ABC in EMA or the detail of flow cost accounting in EMA. It's just knowing that they're relevant. So you get the odd multiple choice question, which will just say which of the following techniques are relevant for EMA. The options are ABC, contribution, flow cost accounting, and it's the top one and the bottom one that are the answer. And that's it. So if you start studying the syllabus, I think you might just scare yourself to death. It's much more sensible to look at the papers, and what you're trying to do, I suppose, there is look for frequency of examination. How often does this sort of thing come up? Detail level, how detailed is the question? And I'm long in the tooth, guys, and I've been doing this a long time. I started teaching in 1984, for goodness sake, probably before a lot of you were born. But I've made these mistakes, but there's no doubt, even now when I pick up a new paper, because I still do that occasionally, where I start is I look at the exams, because I'm getting the style, I'm getting the frequency, I'm getting the depth, I understand what's really being tested. And then when I come back to look at the textbook, or I come back to look at the syllabus, I see that in context effectively. The examining team's guidance and the examiner's reports are incredibly important. Because if you look at an individual topic and then you look at the examiner's reports, you'll see the sort of things the examiner is concerned about, and again it gives you an angle for study. So these are the sort of, this is the reverse, if you like, of what most people think. I think most people think they should look at the syllabus and look at the study guide within textbooks and look at the list of examinable documents, and I think that's wrong. I think that's a mistake. You'll finish up studying things far more detailedly perhaps than you perhaps need to. I mean, my job, I'm a professional person to get people through exams. That's it. You know, all I worry about is what do you need to know to pass? That's not what necessarily syllabuses are written for. Syllabuses are written to say, look, these are the things that you need to know as a professional accountant, and that's right. But my job is to get you through the test. Make sure you've got a career and a future. I always like that about accountancy. Yeah, I think Kaplan used to have a mission statement: we build futures one success story at a time. And that's a brilliant mission. Absolutely brilliant idea. Wish I thought of it myself. Yeah, and it's true. It provides you with a future, and that's what the syllabus is about. But the exam is the test that, if you like, the gateway to your future. And only once you've done all that would I then start to look at study support videos or course material or textbooks and so forth. And clearly, that's an important choice. You've got to decide, where you get your study from, who's going to provide you with the support that you need. And obviously, I'm not going to talk about that particularly. There's lots of suppliers out there, and you've got to make your choices. Okay. The ACCA also provide lots of information about exam technique and give you syllabus update articles. I mean, I will mention articles are critically important. I used to write articles a lot when I was involved. And I quite like writing articles at the time. And why did I do that? Why did I write an article? I wrote an article because I was going to examine something. I remember writing an article on linear programming and then set a question based on my article. So I did. Well, because I was worried that linear programming is notoriously difficult. And what I didn't want is lots of people failing my exam because they weren't sort of like tipped off already that things were coming up. The articles are tremendously important, and examiners are encouraged to write them, or the members of the examining panel are encouraged to write them, or third-party freelancers write them under instruction from the examining panel. Do something on this. Okay, so they're really, really, really important. And again, things like that and the examining team's guidance and the examiner's reports are there to support you. So I would encourage you to do that. So the main point of our conversation today, actually, having spent 15 minutes on examiner's comments, is to talk about, in general terms, is to talk about the examiner's comments and some general points. Now, they're written every sitting, and it's inconceivable to my mind that there isn't input from the examiner themselves. There's quite a large examining team. The ACCA are hugely professional. There's an examiner, there's an assessor, there's a subject coordinator, there's various people involved. Yeah, and so so you'll see comments on the ACCA website about the examining panel a lot, and I would always say that the main person there is probably the examiner. So the idea that the examiner's comments isn't written, at least with an input from the examiner, is inconceivable to my mind. And when you read them, and you should read them, and they're an excellent document, it normally gives a pretty strong hint as what's been examined. Now, the ACCA have a policy whereby in, let's say, the March and the June paper of a year, that around June, just after June, they will issue an example paper which includes no more than 50% of the written questions from the previous 2 diets. That makes sense. So in APM, where there'll be 6 questions in March and June combined, we only get to see 3. Right? And as a tutor, I find that frustrating because I'd like to see every question. Yeah, and as a student, that's also a problem. But then again, you shouldn't be question spotting. You should be preparing yourself to take a paper. But if you read the examiner's comments, it's usually pretty clear what came up in every paper, in my opinion. You can probably see, although you don't see the question, at least you see the topic and the sort of things that cause problems. Yeah, equally, the examiner's comments also deal with specific problems that have resulted from that particular exam, areas of concern. I remember writing an examiner's report about the linear programming question that I mentioned, and it struck me as odd, and I said so in the examiner's report, that no one really in the world near enough got to part C. They all got stuck on part A, which was drawing the linear programming diagram, and didn't really get to the heart of it, which is what C was about. And I said so. And then what did I do? 6 months, a year, 18 months later, I wrote another question which just had part C in it, because I wanted to know that they could use that information. And you can, when you look back at that, the examiner's report that I wrote gave an indication of where I was going to go in the future, and I did. I mean, I'll wait a little bit, obviously, because there has to be a reasonable lead time. And by the way, that's also true of articles. When articles come out, the chances are that the next examining point might not include the article, but the one after should. But personally, I mean, I'd look at articles in the last 6 months and say, right, these are things that could be tested. Okay. Equally, just to come back to this point about problems in a diet, normally you get 2 examples of OTs that were particularly difficult and explained. Now that's interesting. People sort of, I think, perhaps overrate that idea, because the ACCA are incredibly fair. What they want you to do is pass. What they want to do is give you a fair chance. And the most difficult OTs isn't necessarily what determines whether you pass or fail. So don't stress too much about the most difficult items. If you can get most of the more straightforward items, I'll talk about some technique in a moment, then you should do that. Equally, what the examiner's comments do is give you links to past exam questions that might be sort of related to the questions that came up, because they're not publishing them. That's another clear hint, if you like, as to what came up in the real exam. So it's very, very, very handy. I'd always guard against question spotting too much, I have to say. It's always very tempting, that, isn't it, Geoff? What's the tip? What's the tip? What should I focus on? And my advice there is always the same. Try and prepare professionally, and then towards the very, very end of your preparation, the last week before the exam, that's when you might start to think about, well, okay, what am I expecting here? And focus on tips that people might give you. Just please remember, right, tips are just guesses. And a good tutor will have a good idea, but they don't know. And I would say that, from my point of view, I don't know what's coming up. Okay, no, it's certainly not in PM, because basically everything's coming up. It's mainly objectively tested. I know, broadly speaking, what I might like to see in section C, each individual time, but it is just a guess. So just be careful with tips. Okay. Now, 1 or 2 things coming out of examiners' comments in terms of technique, and I think I would support this, is that whenever you do an exam, and of course you might be doing the exam in CBE, or you might be doing the exam on paper. I think generally speaking with PM, you're now on CBE, aren't you? And therefore you need to look at the requirements. Always look at the requirements first, because it provides a context for the scenario. I mean, I can write a scenario with 5 different questions on the end of it. I can provide information which is interesting background, or could be core, depending upon the requirement that's been set. Yeah, so if I'm asking a question, what are the benefits of zero-based budgeting? The scenario might include a little bit of extraneous information that you don't need. So if you read the scenario first, you don't realize that actually what I'm asking you to focus on is just the bits that concern zero basing. I mean, that's a important professional skill, isn't it? To be able to identify what's relevant information and what's not relevant information. I would also be careful about reading all the requirements first, because sometimes, like a second requirement can hint at an approach required for an earlier requirement. So it's conceivable that you write a question, and the second requirement talks about, let's say, information required to do a budget. And part A talks about, if you like, budgeting approaches. Now, of course, if you haven't read both requirements, it's conceivable that in the first bit, budgeting approaches, you start to write about the information requirement. but actually that's in part B. So read both requirements and it gives you a hint as to what's included in context with A and B. I hope that makes sense. So read every requirement before you start. Why do people fail exams? That's always a, why do you think people fail exams? What do you think? I'm going to turn the chat panel again so I can see it, because there aren't too many people. A lot of people will watch this recorded, presumably. Why do you think people fail an exam? Do you think it's knowledge? They just don't know? Why do you fail an exam? Because a lot of you won't necessarily have done have failed exams before. That's what when I was studying. I didn't fail exams, and I came into I didn't do ACCA. I have to confess, I did ACA, ICAW, and then suddenly there's a very real prospect that I might fail a paper. Oh my word! Why is that? And it's a very interesting question. People say, "No, I'm not doing enough question practice," for example, as one suggestion's come from the chat panel. Yeah, it's very interesting. I think the main reason that people are not successful and fail exams is they fail to answer the question. That's it. You have all this knowledge, you've studied really hard, you've worked hard, you're bright, and then you fail to answer the question. In particular, here, multi-parted requirements. So if I gave you a question, calculate and justify, we know from past analysis that 50% of students will not justify. They'll just calculate. For some reason, they have this blindness to second requirements, this word and. And that's one of the principal reasons why people fail. They simply do not answer the question that's been set. They instead demonstrate knowledge or concentrate on the first part. I know that's an obvious statement, and you think to yourself, well, surely I would never do that. But I would be if I was you, be very, very in tune with that word and in a requirement. Yeah, and we'll talk about the distinction between describe and explain in a moment. One thing I would say is that the examiner's comments make it absolutely clear you must not go beyond the question. Okay. Now, one of the things that myself as PM, if you like, involvement and the APM examiner, one thing that we agreed at the time is that assessing performance does not mean improve performance. So in PM, you're assessing performance, and in APM, you might be trying to fix the problems. So in PM, normally, you're really just sort of trying to, in section C of the paper, for example, you are trying to assess the performance of the business and talk about the implications. You're not trying to fix anything. And it's not asked for. And if it's not asked for, there's no marks for it in the marking guide. And if there's no marks for it in the marking guide, you can't score. So be very careful about going beyond the question. The examiner's comments often make that point. Okay. This is very interesting, actually. In performance assessment questions, now, what does that mean? It means questions in section C where I give you some numbers. I say, here's the revenue. Here's the revenue last year. How do you think the business is performing? And you can say, well, look, I've worked out a growth number. It's growing quickly. Yeah. And interestingly, in performance assessment questions, which are very common in the exam, in section C of the exam, would you believe there are more marks for, if you like, an explanation, more marks for an implication than there are for a calculation? And that's true in many other types of paper. Yeah, interestingly, we're going to talk about this later. In relevant cash flow questions, very often the question might be, what are the relevant cash flows for the decision, and provide a justification for that. There are as many marks for justification as there are for the calculation, and people forget that. So if you're asked for, in a performance assessment question to do some analysis, we'll do that, but be prepared to explain it. And certainly, by the way, I mean, this is something the examiner's comments refer to all the time. Saying something like, the revenue's up by $50,000, I'm sorry, is completely meaningless. If my revenue's up $50,000, I'm feeling very rich. if oh, I don't know, if a massive organization, British Telecom or Alibaba, yeah, if their revenue's up $50,000, it's not a drop in the ocean, is it? A percentage is much more useful, if you like, than an absolute figure. So be aware of that. Here's an interesting sort of, again, all coming out of examiners' comments, massive mark earning points from the examiner, hugely generous comments, really. In variance analysis, it says, be prepared to give the reason and the cause that go beyond the mathematical truth. In variance analysis. So if I said to you, what's the cause of an adverse material price variance? Yeah, and I gave you a choice. We have paid more than we planned for materials is one answer. Yeah. And B, we have bought better quality than planned, which is the better answer. Which is the better answer? What do you think, A or B? It's not a test. I'm just interested in what you think. In the chat panel, what do you think? What is the cause of an adverse material price variance? What's the first thing that popped into your head? And the chances are, yeah, for an awful lot of people, it's A. You know, we have paid more than we planned for materials, which is obviously completely true. That is quite clearly a true statement. Yeah. The problem is, it's just a statement of mathematical truth. Excuse me. It's just a statement of mathematical truth, isn't it? It's not really adding value. And that's where, again, the examiner's very concerned that certainly in section C, you wouldn't get a multiple choice question. In section C, coming to a root cause is better. Although the first point is true, it doesn't really score you many marks, because what you're effectively saying is the actual price that you paid for materials is 6 and the standard price is 5, and therefore you've paid more for materials. Well, congratulations, you've just effectively said 6 is a number that's bigger than 5. And you're not really adding any accounting value, are you? Imagine saying to a client, well, the reason you've paid more for the materials because 6 is a bigger number than 5. And if you put it in that context, you realize how silly that is. But if you say, look, the reason that you've got these big adverse variances is because you bought better quality, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, the examiner is very impressed. Yeah, so in variance analysis, I'm going to take my tick off there because the correct answer is B. Yeah, in variance analysis, be prepared to give the true reason for something rather than the mathematical truth. Try and think about that in terms of context. Now, these 3 verbs are probably the most used in PM: describe, explain, and discuss. And it's clearly very important that you understand the difference. Yeah, so a description is made, I suppose, is primarily to describe the main features, isn't it? The main features of something. But an explain, I think an explain, it does include a description, yeah, but it must give a reason, and ideally an example. So if I ask you to explain zero-based budgeting, by all means, you've got to describe it. Yeah, but you've got to give a reason for its existence or a reason for the approach. Why are in zero-based budgeting are the numbers that I put forward challenged? Because they're challenged in zero-based budgeting. Once you study it, you'll know that. And then give an example where someone might put a number in the zero-based budgeting which they don't actually believe in, and when it's challenged, it's removed. So description, reason, example. Description, reason, example. That's how you explain something. And discuss requires a balance. So you need positive points and you need negative points, yeah, or you need to look at the situation from different perspectives, different stakeholders. And the thing about discuss, people get hung up about discuss and think there's got to be an answer, you know, a correct answer. Discuss the usefulness of variances, and you feel as though what you've got to do is say, well, the variances are useful. There's my conclusion. But it's not a discussion. A discussion is the things that you think about in order to reach the conclusion. The conclusion is worth practically nothing. It's the story that you need. So think about from that point of view. Tell me the story. Yeah, and of course, the discussion questions in section C tend to be judgmental areas. They tend to be judgmental things. So there's no right answer. So tell me the story, and that's how you score the marks. Don't leap to the don't try and leap to the conclusion. Yeah, so I'm going to give you a judgmental area to discuss. Tell me the story that goes behind it, and you score lots of marks. Don't worry about whether you're right or wrong, because the whole point about a discussion is it's probably going to be judgmental. These are all comments coming out of the examiner's report, which I have obviously embellished a bit just to add some value. Yeah, but in relevant cash flow questions, now, again, I don't know where you are up to in your studies, but in relevant cash flow questions where you're trying to make a decision, look at this. Half the marks are available for an explanation of your answer. Half. And that includes things, for example, that you decide are not relevant. And that's why I always say in my PM classes, if you're doing a relevant cash flow question and you come up with a cash flow that is not relevant, don't miss it out. Put the thing in at a zero value and provide an explanation as to why it's been excluded. And therefore you score half the marks. Half the marks. So a 20-mark question, 10 is for the explanations. The examiner wants to make sure you're not getting it right by accident. Okay? It goes without saying that, headings and subheadings are critical. I don't know how many scripts you've marked. The chances are the answer to that is none. Yeah, but I've marked thousands of scripts over the years. I remember my first exam, I personally moderated every student in the world. There wasn't many people sitting in. So anyone that was marginal, I personally looked at. And there's no doubt that headings and subheadings make marking easier, and you want that. There's one or two things I wanted to say about OT, because most of those comments I've just made were on section C, because the examiner's comments tends to be on section C. And that's fair enough, because they don't tend to give away what's come up in the multiple choice or the objective test questions. And I want to talk a little bit about my general tips on OT, because it is 60% of the paper, isn't it? It's an awful lot of stuff. And I wanted to therefore add a bit of value to our session today. Interestingly, there are questions which require calculation, obviously, and there are also questions which require an answer which is wordy. What is the advantage of? And here's 4 answers. And the interesting thing about this is that very often the wordy items can be 50% of the OT. That's not an aim. That tends to be what it looks like. And the thing about wordy items, although they're not necessarily easier, my goodness me, they're quicker. It doesn't take long. It takes 30 seconds, a minute to make your mind up. And that gets you ahead of the time curve. I do think exam technique is really important. And doing the wordy items first is a very sensible thing. Okay, so I do that. Secondly, you should read the requirement and the question and note the format of the answer. Is it multiple choice? One of A, B, C, D is right. Or is it multiple requirements? Or do you have to put a number? And if it's a number, what's the format of the number? Is it 2 decimal places? Is it 3 decimal places? Don't break the rules there. Yeah. Then I would tend to look at the answers. And the reason for that is it sometimes gives you a hint as to where you should start. And it sometimes gives you a hint as to one of the items that just looks way out of line with the rest, called an outlier. I'll show you examples of that in a moment as to why that is relevant. But do the wordy items first, read the requirement, note the format, quick look at the answers, and I'll show you an example as to why that's important in a moment. Then work the question. Work the question. And I think, to be honest, the calculator in certainly numbers questions is almost your worst enemy. It's your biggest friend, isn't it, in the exam in some ways, but it's also your worst enemy because it's very tempting to tap away on your calculator without working logically. And I would encourage you to slow down to get faster. Just work the question, work logically, finish off the workings. And what I mean by that, for example, if you're doing a variances calculation, your calculation might be, well, the variance is 1,000 hours multiplied by $5 per hour, $5 per hour, yeah? And therefore the answer you've got is 5,000, yeah? It's quite conceivable that one of the incorrect answers, known as the distractors, might be this number. And that's what I mean by finish the workings, get to the end point. Don't stop halfway through. And the thing with your calculator, it's quite conceivable that you get 1,000 in your calculator, you look down at the answers and 1,000's there. Ooh, and therefore it's right. You've not finished, so finish and then select. Now, of course, what happens in an exam environment when you try and select and it's not there? Oh no. And it's one of these interesting features of objective test questions, isn't it? That it's rare really when you think about it, that you get instant feedback that you're wrong. Normally in exams, and when the exams are a written paper, when you get to the higher level papers like APM, you're not really wrong. You don't know that you're wrong. You just carry on. But in PM, you're getting a constant reminder that you're not right. So what are you going to do then? Well, clearly you could go back and have another look, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea. Although you've got to be careful about how long you spend doing that. But if you are going to guess, yeah, why don't you guess smart? So here's my suggestions of how you might guess smart. These aren't made up. This is based on a university study in Liverpool in the UK. John Moore University came up with a report which I got hold of. It was very interesting, and it looked at thousands of objective testing questions set by all sorts of people, yeah, and it made up some suggestions, and I quite like these ideas. If you look at the ABCD of a multiple choice item, and two of them are opposites, so answer A is 5,000 positive and answer B is 5,000 negative, yeah, if you have to guess one of those two, because opposites, one of them is probably right. That's just an interesting idea. And the reason for that is the examiners are always told that they have to have sensible distractors that are capable of calculation. Well, surely a negative number is an opposite of a positive number, or it could be that 5,000 is adverse and 5,000 is favorable. That could also, if you like, be another opposite. Yeah, one of those will be right, because it's the easiest distractor to produce, the opposite of what the correct answer. Yeah, outliers, numbers that don't fit with the rest of them, are very often wrong. Not always, but very often wrong. So again, if you're guessing, ignore the outlier, the one that looks ridiculous compared to the other. If you haven't heard of an answer, it's wrong. So if one of the answers is, let's say, covariance, and you think, what on earth is a covariance? Answer C, covariance. It's wrong. This is not a trick exam. It's a proper exam written by professional people in the professional organisation. They're not going to trap you. But a covariance, if it's not in the syllabus, it's wrong. And don't try and second guess the examiner. You get a lot of that. What am I supposed to say here? I wouldn't think like that. Don't try and second guess the examiner. There isn't traps. I've been in examiners panels. They're very much on your side. So trust the system is my advice. Yeah. The other thing I would say about guessing smart is sometimes you can just think about direction rather than value. So you don't know the answer, but you know it's adverse. You don't know the answer, but you know it. You feel it's a negative number. Does that make sense? So sometimes you might be able to guess on that basis. You're pretty sure there's an overpayment here. You're pretty sure it's adverse. Therefore, that's what I'm going to guess. Obviously, nobody wants to have to guess. I mean, I fully accept that's not the greatest possible news, is it? Yeah. And I mentioned this idea in section B, where if an answer is given to a previous items, it's right. That's always been the case. It's rare that, but in item number 1, you're given a question to work out. In item number 3, the examiner tells you it's 5 per hour. Then I'm sorry, but that's right, because they wouldn't allow you. What the ACCA don't want to do is put off the good student. And I'm quoting there. They don't want to, if a good student gets this wrong because we've got a poorly worded question, they won't allow that. So if in answer 3, it indicates it's 5, that is the right answer to part 1 if it was asked that way. Now this is just an OT item which illustrates the point I was making I was making before, really. You look at those 4 answers. So you read the question, what is the total number of units? The total number of units which must be made and sold to make a profit of 45. I'm not necessarily going to do this question particularly. And you look at A, B, C, D, yeah, and can you see that if you're guessing, A looks to be a little bit outside the line of the rest, isn't it? The rest look quite a lot bigger than that. And so if you are guessing, yeah, you might guess at B, C, and D. That's what I mean by an outlier. By the way, the correct answer is 22,500. This is just an item out of I think it's the Kaplan revision kit, actually. One particular question. So that's what I mean by outliers. Outliers are almost always wrong, and A is wrong in that case. It's not about me working this particular question. I don't think that's the point of this. I mean, I can do that, but we got a time pressure. And here's another one, example OT item, again out of the appropriate revision kit, yeah, where you read the question, which of the following statements about throughput accounting ratios, which again you might not know anything about at the moment, you might just be starting, I don't know. Yeah, throughput accounting ratios are true, are true, A, B, C, D, E. What most people do with a question like that is they read 1, and then they read 2, and then they read 3, and they decide whether they're true or false, and then look at the answers. That's how the people work. But actually, I suggested earlier that a sensible way of doing this is to look at the answers first. So if you look at those answers, can you see that with this particular question, you could actually not do that. You don't have to look at 1, 2, and 3. What could you do? Yeah, you could just say, well, look, why don't I look at 3 here? And if 3 is true, yeah, if 3 is true, then the answer must be A or D. End of story. And I only then need to look at 1. I don't need to look at 2, do I? And that's what I mean about by looking at the answers might sometimes give you a hint as to approach that you can take. That's not hugely common. It's not always the case, yeah, but it does occur. Okay. Oops. Oh, sorry, my system's gone wrong. So, in summary, because it's just about an hour, we've got 10 minutes for any questions and so forth. I would say that examiners' comments are really, really useful, and I've just summarised there, yeah, 1 or 2 points that you might like to take into account. All the stuff that I talked about today appeared in examiners' comments in the last 2 years, yeah, and you should try and understand those points and incorporate them into the way that you work. Yeah, the study support resources on the ACCA website are brilliant, absolutely brilliant, first class. It's a very good website. It's clearly able to be navigated. It's excellent. So make use of the study support resources on the ACCA website. Yeah, and obviously you want to practice using the ACCA practice tests and the practice platform. You don't want to be walking into a CBE exam, if you like, unsure about format and things of that sort. Yeah, so the study support resources I mentioned a second ago, yeah, this is the front page, if you like, and you click on ACCA qualification, and then you can go off and there's all sorts of things underneath that. It's almost too big to just comment on just now, but just have an explore around. It's freely available resources. It's written by industry experts. It's superbly focused. It really is excellent. So I would encourage you to do that. Okay. Equally, the virtual learning centre has sections on the basic requirements. I mean, the ACCA. I remember when I was involved in this, that very, very, very concerned about people operating in a second language. They work really hard, if you like, to make sure that the questions are clear, that the questions are unambiguous, that they're supporting, if you like, someone that doesn't have English as the first language. But clearly you need to be able to operate in English to pass this exam. Clearly, Yeah, but they try. I do assure you that they try and make that fair. And obviously, come on, you're accountants, so your basic mathematical skills should be reasonable. How can you possibly be an accountant if not? I make no excuse for making that statement, particularly. Okay, but nonetheless, the virtual learning centres which provide support to help you with any English or any maths or general sort of considerations, and that's tremendously supporting. ACCA don't have to do that, but they do that, and I think it's good support for you. Okay, approved learning partners scheme is where the ACCA are looking at providers such as myself. I've got silver status on the learning partner program. I've been approved, and really you need to make sure that you're picking a learning partner, if you like, that has the credibility and the knowledge that you need. And the approved learning partners scheme is excellent from that point of view. So this is a chap here, presumably he's got an approved learning partner status, and there's a list of approved learning partners. And I would say one of the consequences, of course, for the COVID situation is that a lot of people like myself are flooding out of the market and going online. There's some very, very, very high level people floating around now. Some of my students in the past have got world prizes. One in March 2020 won the world prize for APM, for example. And we're all flooding into the online market. So choice, I think choice is probably at its greatest level, and digital learning is really exploding, isn't it? Because the videos and the materials recorded, you can rewind it, you can watch it when you like, 24/7. You can watch it on your PC, you can watch it on your phone. So I think that's really exploding. But hey, if you want face to face, I mean, I'm sure there are some colleges still doing that. I'm just not. I don't know. I'm 60, so I'm not sure I particularly want to be in a room full of people that are worried and sweating. Okay, so obviously it looks like a lot of people are going to watch this recorded because the expression of interest was huge. Yeah, and no doubt Esther will put up the recording, and I can see people asking questions about that. If there are questions now that I have missed, then I'm more than happy to sort of to try and answer them now. I didn't see any questions answered that Esther, that I didn't answer. I fully accept there might not be any questions. That's fair enough. Okay, well, look, here are the connections. I don't know whether, Esther, you've got any concluding comments. There's a phone number there. There's an email address there. If you can reach out, I'm sure the ACCA are there if you like to support you.
Yeah. Thank you, Geoff, for the presentation. I think even myself, I've learned a lot. Listening to you. Right, so I think just repeat, we will send out the recording link to all of you using the email address that you have registered with us when you register for the conference. So don't worry. Similarly, the slide deck will be sending out to you as well. Yep, so thank you everyone for participating, and thank you, Geoff, for the wonderful session. We need to get ready for the next one, so I need to close off this. Bye, everyone.
Good. Okay.
And
okay,
all the best.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
And good luck. Get this exam passed. Well done.
Bye.
Bye-bye.